today's episode of History's Greatest Battles. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. In 66 AD, an improbable Jewish victory against Rome inspired a rebellion that unleashed unimaginable suffering. The men who defended their land faced the brutal realities of siege warfare, starvation, relentless assaults, and the constant threat of death. When the rebellion collapsed, Rome's retribution was merciless. Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple burned to ash, and the population enslaved or scattered. The rebellion's end brought seismic shifts in history. Judaism, severed from its temple, evolved into a decentralized rabbinic faith that has subsequently endured for millennia. Christianity, once a Jewish sect, expanded across the Roman Empire, laying the foundations for Western civilization. The Jewish nation's long fight for survival led to the eventual reestablishment of Israel in 1948. The Roman reaction to the rebellion set a precedent for the brutal suppression of dissent, a lesson not lost on modern regimes. These threats, born from the events of this battle, are woven into the geopolitical, religious, and cultural fabric of the modern world. This is the story of the battle that changed the religious undertones of our world today. It's a complicated story, so if you're in this for pure entertainment value, please listen to a different episode. Let's now experience the Battle of Beth-Horon.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 87, The Battle of Beth-Horon, October of 66 Current Era. Roman forces, 30,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Jewish forces, roughly 14,000 light infantry, very few cavalry. The overwhelming defeat of a Roman punitive force ignited a wildfire of belief among the Jewish populace. What had been skepticism turned into unshakable conviction. Compromise was a betrayal, and God himself had ordained their victory. This fervent delusion swept the nation into a full-scale revolt, a bold gamble that would bring not deliverance, but ruin.
Conflict between the ancient Jews and the Romans was, in many ways, an inevitability. Roman influence in Judaea began with Pompey's arrival in 63 BC, and from the start, the differences were stark. The Romans, pragmatic and imperial, sought control above all else, while the Jews, deeply religious and fiercely independent, could not easily accept subjugation by a foreign power. Pompey's intervention in Judean politics, backing one royal claimant against his brother, set the tone for Rome's rule. This decision not only exacerbated internal divisions, but also sparked a series of Roman actions that alienated the Jewish population, creating a legacy of mistrust and resistance. Over the next century, Rome imposed a succession of rulers on Judaea, each chosen for their loyalty to the empire. These leaders governed with little regard for the needs or traditions of the people, deepening the divide between the occupiers and the occupied. During the reign of King Herod, 43 to 44 BC, the infiltration of foreign customs and religious practices became routine, eroding the cultural fabric of Jewish life. For many, Herod's policies represented not progress, but the encroachment of an alien world. Herod's embrace of Hellenistic ideals and his ruthless suppression of perceived threats ignited fierce opposition. The Pharisees, devout interpreters of Jewish law, emerged as defenders of traditional values, challenging Herod's rule with their unwavering commitment to the Torah. Herod's reign saw a rise in lawlessness as bands of outlaws grew bolder and began to align their actions with their political motives. What had once been simple banditry now hinted at rebellion. For a brief period, Caesar Augustus attempted to placate Jewish unrest by granting Judea and Samaria limited self-governance under the oversight of a Syrian governor. The early Roman procurators appeared intent on addressing Jewish grievances, but their efforts were thwarted by a volatile mix of highway bandits, militant religious factions, and the burgeoning resistant movement known as the Zealots. Before long, the emperor and senate, perhaps underestimating Judea's volatility, began appointing mediocre officials to oversee the province, further inflaming tensions. Among these ill-suited appointees was Pontius Pilate, whose tenure in Caesarea marked the beginning of a series of inept and provocative administrations. Pilate's rule was marked by a string of provocations: the public display of imperial symbols in Jerusalem, a direct affront to Jewish religious law, the seizure of temple funds to finance an aqueduct project, and the brutal suppression of protests that followed. Pilate's career ended in disgrace after he ordered a violent crackdown on Samaritan religious gatherings, prompting his removal from office. In AD 39 through 40, Emperor Caligula issued a shocking decree to place his statue within the Jewish temple, a move so inflammatory it could have triggered outright rebellion had it not been thwarted by the courageous defiance of Petronius, the legate in Syria. From that moment on, both Jewish leaders and ordinary citizens recognized that a confrontation with Rome was no longer a distant threat, but an inevitability. Emperor Claudius sought to stabilize Roman control in Judea by appointing Herod Agrippa I, a descendant of Herod the Great, as king, a calculated effort to reconcile Roman authority with Jewish traditions. Agrippa I offered a rare glimmer of hope. Unlike his predecessors, he respected Jewish customs and demonstrated a shrewd diplomatic ability to balance Roman expectations with the needs of his people. Tragically, Agrippa's reign lasted a mere 3 years, extinguishing what many saw as the final chance for Judean autonomy under a king who could bridge the divide between Rome and his people. Agrippa's efforts to reinforce the temple's outer defenses and his attempt to convene a congress of regional leaders drew the wary eyes of Roman authorities, who began to question his motives. After Agrippa's death, Roman mismanagement returned in full force, with the appointment of Cuspis Vatus, a blundering provocateur, as procurator. What followed was a parade of corrupt and obtuse officials whose heavy-handed policies only fueled the growth of the Zealot movement and the escalating unrest. Amid this mounting chaos, self-proclaimed messiahs began to emerge, stirring hopes that the long-awaited end of days was at hand, a time when prophecy promised a ruler who would rise from Jerusalem to reshape the world. Even with the Pharisaic ruling class, including minor priests and local dignitaries, there were signs of sympathy for the Zealot cause as the movement gained momentum. The breaking point came under the disastrously inept rule of Procurator Gessius Florus. 6 years prior, a conflict between Jews and Greeks in the Roman administrative hub of Caesarea prompted Emperor Nero to side with the Greeks, deepening Jewish resentment. By 66 AD, the hostilities between Jews and Greeks had escalated into uncontrollable violence. Florus took a bribe from Jewish leaders, promising intervention, but stood idle as the Jews bore the brunt of the bloodshed, further stoking outrage. Florus escalated tensions by seizing funds from the sacred temple treasury, claiming they were owed as back taxes to Rome, an act of sacrilege that enraged the populace. Florus marched into Jerusalem with troops and demanded a public display of loyalty by forcing the population to welcome 2 of his officers arriving as reinforcements. Even as the crowds, under the urging of their leaders, greeted the reinforcements, Florus ordered his soldiers to mock and ignore the gesture, turning a show of respect into an insult. The insult sparked fresh riots, unleashing a violent counterattack by the Jewish populace that plunged the city into chaos and bloodshed. In May of 66 AD, Eleazar ben Simon, the temple captain, issued a direct challenge to Roman authority by halting the sacrificial offerings traditionally made in honor of the emperor. Flavius Josephus later described this act as nothing less than a declaration of war against Rome. The decision divided the Jewish leadership, with some advocating for the resumption of sacrifices as a desperate concession to avoid a full-scale war. Agrippa II, acting on behalf of Rome, dispatched troops to restore order, but his forces were overwhelmed by Jewish mobs, which had rapidly transformed into a rudimentary army. At the Antonia fortress, the Roman garrison was isolated and, under the guise of an amnesty, brutally massacred, a chilling signal of how far the rebellion had escalated. By now, the rebellion was fully underway, though moderate factions continued to push for a negotiated resolution. Flavius Josephus, the complex and often controversial figure who lived from AD 37 to approximately AD 98, was both a participant in and a chronicler of the Jewish War, a conflict that shaped his life and his legacy. History would come to rely almost entirely on Josephus, a man whose self-interest and cunning ensured his survival and positioned him as the primary voice documenting this war. Debate persists over Josephus's legacy. Was he a traitor who abandoned the Jewish cause, or a pragmatist seeking to safeguard his people's cultural and spiritual survival amidst destruction? Born into the priestly elite, Josephus was a resourceful figure, deeply grounded in Pharisaic tradition, yet equally proficient in the Greco-Roman scholarship of the time. As a young man, Josephus journeyed to Rome shortly after the Great Fire of 64 AD, where he witnessed the empire's overwhelming military power, both a source of fear and reluctant admiration for the patriotic Jew. On this journey, Josephus served as an envoy, advocating for the release of fellow priests detained over a minor infraction, a mission that showcased his diplomatic acumen. Josephus believed resistance against Rome was futile and sought alternatives to outright defiance. This practical mindset stood in stark opposition to the mystical fatalism embraced by many of his contemporaries among the Jewish leadership. Josephus's priestly lineage and intellectual prowess made him an obvious, though reluctant, choice as a military leader during the rebellion, though his own writings often gloss over its deeper causes. Josephus harbored little sympathy for the rebels, whom he repeatedly condemned as bandits, thugs, and irreverent violators of Jewish faith and law. His disdain seemed less rooted in elitism and more in genuine horror at the devastation that engulfed his nation. Josephus often sought a delicate balance, striving to reconcile Rome's imperial demands with the preservation of Jewish traditions and identity. While Josephus opposed rebellion against Rome, the wave of zealotry following the unexpected Jewish victory over Cestius Gallus made dissent a death sentence, leaving him no choice but to navigate the rebellion cautiously. The early triumphs of the Jewish forces quickly gave way to a desperate defense of their fortified cities as the Roman war machine, commanded by Vespasian and his son Titus, advanced relentlessly. Appointed governor general of Galilee by the rebels, Josephus played a dangerous double game, attempting to manage both the rebellion's demands and his own survival. The Jerusalem War Council instructed Josephus to give the appearance of assembling an army from Galilee's unruly militias, a strategy meant to placate the insurgents while they sought a negotiated truce with Rome. Rather than fortifying Galilee's defenses, Josephus devoted much of his energy to outmaneuvering those within the rebellion who doubted his loyalty. Despite these distractions, Josephus managed to organize a limited resistance as Roman forces pressed into Galilee. At Jotapata, Josephus mounted a determined defense, using every tactical advantage to delay the overwhelming and well-equipped Roman army. Jotapata eventually fell, and Josephus escaped death by craftily evading a suicide pact agreed upon by the remaining defenders. Following his surrender, Josephus ingratiated himself with Vespasian and Titus by predicting their rise to imperial power, a prophecy that later proved correct. Spared by the Roman commanders, Josephus served as an interpreter and intelligence advisor, bearing witness to the devastating Roman campaign that culminated in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Following Jerusalem's destruction, Josephus traveled to Rome with his captors, where he spent the remainder of his life writing his major works, including The Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities. Josephus's account of the war offers little objective insight into the rebellion's underlying causes or the factional infighting among the Jews that accelerated Jerusalem's collapse. His writings reveal a shrewd, pragmatic figure whose moral compromises force readers to judge whether he was a contemptible traitor or a clear-eyed realist. The Jewish War stands as a meticulously crafted, if somewhat selective narrative of Rome's brutal campaign in Judea, as seen through the eyes of a priest turned general, prisoner, and imperial historian. The work captures pivotal events of the first century, shaping both Jewish and early Christian histories. Without Josephus's writings, much of the critical period would remain an enigma, lost forever to history. As the rebellion erupted, Procurator Gaius Florus sent an urgent appeal for reinforcements to Cestius Gallus, the Syrian legate overseeing the region's strategic reserves, stationed in Antioch with 4 Roman legions. Though the crisis demanded swift action, Cestius delayed for 3 months before assembling his expeditionary force in response to Florus's plea. At the heart of Cestius's force was the 12th Legion, Fulminata or Thunderbolt, numbering 4,800 soldiers reinforced by detachments of 2,000 infantry from 3 additional legions, bringing the total to roughly 11,000 soldiers. Recognizing the rugged terrain of Judea and Galilee as ideal for swift hit-and-run tactics, Allied monarchs contributed additional forces, like comprising slingers and javelin throwers, what modern tacticians would label light infantry or skirmishers. Had Cestius been a more perceptive commander, he might have valued these specialized units for the challenges ahead. King Antiochus IV of Commagene and Sohaemus of Emesa reinforced Cestius's army with 5,000 cavalry and 8,500 infantry, swelling the ranks with additional regional troops. Altogether, Cestius commanded an imposing force of roughly 32,000 soldiers. As the army marched from Antioch to Ptolemais near modern-day Haifa, Greco-Syrian militias from local towns added another 2,000 men to the force. Though poorly disciplined, these recruits were eager to confront the Jewish rebels. Cestius directed his formidable force to Sheldon on the border of Ptolemais and Galilee, where he unleashed a calculated campaign of terror designed to cow the population. The soldiers slaughtered many of the town's inhabitants, forcing the survivors to flee as they looted and razed Sheldon and its surrounding villages. Cestius left the legate Placidus behind in Ptolemais with 2 infantry cohorts and a cavalry ala, while he pressed forward with a campaign of pacification. His aim was to terrorize the populace along the route to Jerusalem and secure his rear, ensuring no aid would reach the Jewish resistance. The resistance at this stage was primarily composed of roughly a dozen loosely organized bands, numbering about 2,000 fighters in total. Cestius assigned Caesanius, the commander of the 12th Legion, to oversee operations in Galilee. Caesanius advanced on Sepphoris, a strategically critical city in Galilee, known for its pro-Roman sympathies. The city's capitulation set the tone for the rest of the region, which quickly fell into Roman hands. Several insurgent groups retreated to fortified mountain positions at Azamon and Jebel el-Debide in the northwest, where they were pursued by Roman cavalry. The skirmishes resulted in the loss of roughly 200 Roman soldiers, while Jewish casualties soared to 2,000. Simultaneously, Cestius led a detachment southward along the coast to Caesarea, while dispatching forces by land and sea to destroy Joppa. Roman naval units blockaded the port as ground troops stormed the city. Joppa was razed to the ground, and 8,000 of its residents were slaughtered. A separate column marched on Nabatene and its neighboring villages, applying the same brutal tactics of destruction and massacre. From Caesarea, the Roman force advanced along the coast to Antipatris, dispatching a detachment to seize the rebel-held town of Aphek, only to find it abandoned. The Romans demolished the tower and burned the surrounding villages, ensuring no refuge remained for insurgents. The coastal detachments reunited with Cestius's main army at Caesarea, bringing with them the troops responsible for the devastation of Joppa and Nabatene, as preparations began for the march on Jerusalem itself. Having secured Galilee and the Judean coast, Cestius likely calculated that the rebellion could be crushed within 3 weeks, well before the autumn rains turned the roads into quagmires. Cestius's reinforced army moved into Judea, capturing the town of Lydda, which had been abandoned. The Romans burned it to the ground, executing 50 Jews who had stayed behind. The detachment veered off toward Aphek, modern-day Medjugorje, where they confronted and scattered a gathering of insurgent fighters. Up to this point, the Jewish resistance appeared fragmented, often dissolving before the advancing Romans, reinforcing Cestius's belief that his campaign of terror had successfully broken their will. The Roman army pressed forward along the road to Jerusalem, reaching the point where the plain gave way to the steep and treacherous ascent through the Beth-Horon gorge near Emmaus. Cestius's forces established a camp for the night at Gabal, modern-day Gibeon, a fortified position just over 6 miles northwest of Jerusalem. Overconfident from the minimal resistance encountered thus far, Cestius advanced the next morning in disorganized marching formation, recklessly allowing his baggage train and its escort to fall far behind the main column. In a critical breach of Roman military doctrine, Cestius neglected to conduct proper reconnaissance of the surrounding terrain. Meanwhile, the Jewish forces capitalized on the high ground that Cestius's columns had carelessly overlooked. From their elevated positions, Jewish sentries meticulously observed the Roman formations, identifying their vulnerabilities. The Jewish fighters prepared a coordinated ambush along the ridgelines, setting the stage for a devastating assault. Despite it being the Sabbath, Jewish fighters surged from Jerusalem, striking the Roman vanguard as it struggled to shift from its marching column into battle formation. Jewish forces, bolstered by warriors from Adiabene and led by Niger of Perea and Silas of Batanea, veteran defectors from Agrippa II's army, pressed the attack on the Roman front lines. At the same time, Simon Bar Gioris, a rough-edged but magnetic guerrilla leader, unleashed his forces on the Roman rearguard as it struggled through the narrow confines of the Beth-Horon Pass. The Romans endured heavy losses. 515 men, comprising of 400 infantry and 115 cavalry, killed, compared to only 22 Jewish casualties. Even more damaging, they lost many of the pack mules critical for hauling their supplies and their equipment. Despite the ambush, the Romans managed to regroup. Their forward units disengaged methodically and turned back to support the main column. The Jewish fighters, lacking the organization to exploit their initial success, were unable to prevent the legions from reforming into their disciplined battle formations. Cestius successfully reassembled his forces and retreated to the relative safety of his camp at Gabal. Determined, though, to press on, the Romans regrouped and resumed their advance toward Jerusalem, hoping to secure much-needed supplies. Cestius pushed through resistance from Jewish skirmishers and established a camp on Mount Scopus, positioned less than a mile from Jerusalem's walls. Believing the Jewish factions were too divided to replicate their earlier success at Beth-Horon, Cestius hesitated to launch an immediate assault. While Cestius delayed, King Agrippa II sent envoys to negotiate an amnesty with the rebels. The Jewish response, though, was swift and brutal. One intermediary was killed, and the other gravely injured. Over the next 3 days, Cestius dispatched foraging parties to gather grain, revealing his growing concern over dwindling supplies. Meanwhile, he waited in vain for signs of discord among the defenders behind Jerusalem's walls. On October the 15th, Cestius led his forces into Jerusalem's outskirts, where he observed the rebels retreating behind a secondary wall, taking up positions in well-fortified defenses. The Romans set the suburb of Bethesa ablaze, hoping the fiery display would break the spirit of the Jewish defenders. Avoiding the heavily fortified Antonia fortress, Cestius redirected his forces toward the city's western wall, opposite Herod's palace, seeking a weaker point of entry. According to Josephus, had Cestius launched a decisive assault at this juncture, Jerusalem would almost certainly have fallen to the Romans. While Josephus's claim that Procurator Gaius Florus bribed Roman officers to prolong the conflict for personal gain lacks credibility, the delay remains a critical misstep in Roman strategy. For 6 days, the Romans maintained pressure on the city, culminating in an assault by a select detachment of archers targeting the northern side of the temple complex near the Antonia fortress. Abruptly, and without explanation, Cestius ordered a halt to the assault. The looming winter, the fierce resistance displayed by Jewish fighters at Beth-Horon, and a growing shortage of provisions and pack animals likely influenced his decision to retreat. Cestius repeated his earlier blunders as he withdrew, failing to secure the high ground above the Beth-Horon pass. This oversight allowed the now confident Jewish fighters to harass his retreating column relentlessly, all the way back to Gabao. Only the onset of nightfall spared Cestius' forces from complete annihilation. For 2 futile days, the Romans lingered at Gabao, even as more Jewish forces fortified positions on the high ground, overlooking their route of retreat to the coast. Jewish fighters sealed the pass, cutting off the Romans' escape, while others launched attacks from the slopes above, unleashing a torrent of arrows that pinned down the Roman cavalry in the narrow gorge. The Jews turned captured Roman catapults against their former owners, inflicting further casualties and deepening the chaos within the retreating ranks. Desperate to save his remaining mobile forces, Cestius ordered the abandonment of the battered baggage train and sacrificial rear guard. The 12th Legion suffered devastating losses: 5,300 infantry and 480 cavalry, along with the entirety of their pack animals and artillery, weapons that the Jews would later turn to their advantage during Titus's siege of Jerusalem 4 years later. The Jews also captured the Eagle Standard of the 12th Legion, a humiliating blow to Roman honor that could only be redeemed through a decisive victory. When the shattered remnants of Cestius's army finally limped back into Syria, the rebels held firm control over Jerusalem, much of Judea, and a strategic stronghold at Fort Macarius in southern Perea. The shocking Jewish victory at Beth-Horon galvanized many hesitant Judeans, pushing them to side with the increasingly dominant war faction. This surge in support dashed any hope for compromise with Rome and set the stage for a full-scale and catastrophic conflict. Had the insurgents been crushed, the influential moderate leaders advocating reconciliation might have regained control, potentially averting the rebellion altogether. Instead, the victory forced many potential collaborators to flee Jerusalem, seeking safety in the Decapolis cities or under the protection of Agrippa's forces. Meanwhile, others rallied to the rebel cause, driven by fear, growing momentum, or newfound confidence that divine favor was on their side. This conflict marked the beginning of the final chapter for the independent Jewish nation, a turning point from which there would be no return. Josephus's well-documented bias against the Jewish insurgents leaves us with a distorted view of their origins, their goals, and their influence. Yet when we piece together the fragments, it becomes evident that paramilitary bands, part insurgents, part outlaws, had been a constant presence in Judea since the Maccabean rebellion of the mid-2nd century BC. These groups were far from unified, but shared greater ideological alignment with the Pharisaic factions than with the aristocratic Sadducees, who dominated the priesthood. In the time of the Macabees, the Hasidim, holy men committed to Jewish law, served as spiritual motivators for the warriors. These Hasidim evolved into a precursor to the Pharisees during the later Hasmonean era, standing firm as the ruling dynasty drifted toward Hellenism and increasing corruption. Under John Hyrcanus II and Alexander Jannaeus in the mid-1st century BC, they faced persecution, which likely drove many to form outlaw bands. groups that often blurred the line between resistance fighters and common criminals. Queen Alexandra, the final Hasmonean ruler, sought to reconcile with these factions, but her death marked the end of such efforts. The incompetence of her successors created a power vacuum that invited Roman interference and eventual control. Under Herod the Great, these outlaw groups proliferated to such an extent that much of his military's resources were devoted to suppressing them, a campaign in which he achieved moderate success. These bands transitioned from localized resistance movements to full-fledged political insurgents following Judea's shift from a client kingdom to a Roman province after Herod's death. Josephus attributes the formation of a fourth philosophy to Judas of Galilee and Sadoc in response to the census imposed by the Syrian legate Quirinius in AD 6. This philosophy stood apart from the Sadducees, Pharisees, and the Essenes. Central to this movement was the belief that only God could command allegiance. No earthly ruler or foreign deity had the right to demand taxes, worship, or obedience from Jews, particularly in the land they considered a divine inheritance. Adding to the sense of religious violation was the economic despair of small landowners who were suffocated by Roman taxes, temple tithes, and a faltering economy. Many were forced off their land by foreclosure, reduced to laboring on the very property they once owned. After the completion of Herod's massive temple expansion, unemployment became so dire that his successors resorted to street paving projects to prevent widespread destitution. A potent combination of devout faith and crushing poverty drove many into the ranks of the emerging guerrilla groups. Although Josephus provides a fragmented account of the Zealots' origins, it's clear they were not a unified entity with a cohesive or long-standing structure. A closer reading of Josephus, supplemented by modern analysis, reveals a patchwork of groups, each with its own distinct goals and methods. The Sicarii, or daggermen, operated as urban assassins, targeting Jewish elites who collaborated with Rome. Armed with curved daggers hidden under their cloaks, they struck swiftly and without warning. Their ties to the broader Zealot movement remain unclear, suggesting a degree of autonomy in their operations. The Sicarii frequently clashed with more moderate factions within the resistance and are widely believed to have orchestrated the infamous Last Stand at Masada, a story often romanticized in later retellings. As the Jewish war began, various guerrilla groups were already active across Galilee and Judea, preparing for the inevitable clash with Rome. Two key leaders emerged from these factions: John of Gischala, who commanded operations in Galilee, and Simon bar Gioris, who led efforts in Judea. Eleazar ben Simon, the temple captain whose refusal to offer sacrifices for the Roman emperor ignited the revolt, likely commanded his own faction within the Zealot movement. By some estimates, a dozen or more guerrilla bands operated during this period, each fielding between 1,000 and 3,000 fighters. Their armaments included spears, swords, javelins, slings, and darts, but their lack of armor left them poorly equipped for prolonged engagements against Roman forces. Their command structure was rudimentary, lacking the centralized hierarchy that characterized Roman military organization. The Jerusalem War Council was forced to negotiate directly with individual guerrilla leaders, as no centralized staff or chain of command existed to coordinate their efforts. As a result, leadership relied heavily on the charisma and direct involvement of each chieftain. The rank-and-file fighters owed their loyalty not to the Jerusalem leadership, but exclusively to their own commanders. Josephus' claim of organizing and training a 60,000-strong army in Galilee modeled after Roman standards seems to be an exaggeration, if not outright fabrication. In response to the rebellion, Emperor Nero appointed Vespasian, a hardened veteran of the Britannic campaigns, to lead a punitive expedition to crush the uprising in Judea. As Vespasian methodically assembled his forces, a group of sympathetic priests and local elites convened a war council in Jerusalem to plan their defense against the inevitable Roman retaliation. The council divided Judea into defensive zones, appointing 5 generals to oversee and organize resistance efforts within their assigned territories. Early attempts to strike at the remaining Roman garrisons, including a disastrous failure at Ascalon, achieved little. Meanwhile, in Galilee, Josephus struggled to unify the fractious rebel groups in anticipation of the Roman advance. Josephus hesitated, failing to consolidate his forces or fortify key towns. Instead, he wasted precious time attempting to fashion a Roman-style army from untrained and undisciplined recruits. When Vespasian launched his invasion, Galilee fell swiftly. He advanced methodically, using the pro-Roman territory of Samaria as a secure base to push into Judea. In 69 AD, a vicious Roman succession crisis interrupted Vespasian's campaign for nearly 18 months. During this pause, infighting among rival zealot factions plunged Jerusalem into chaos, weakening its already weak defenses. Reports of turmoil within the Jewish ranks prompted Vespasian's son, Titus, to initiate a calculated siege of Jerusalem, employing blockade tactics to encircle the city. In 70 AD, the Roman forces breached Jerusalem's defenses, culminating in the destruction of the Holy Temple, a devastating blow to the Jewish people. Several isolated fortresses, including the infamous Masada, continued to resist Roman forces for an additional 3 years. The Jewish nation, shattered and dispossessed, was stripped of all political authority in Judea. The Romans renamed the province Syria Palestina, a calculated insult evoking the ancient Philistine adversaries of Israel. In the aftermath, the Roman governor permitted Talmudic scholars to establish a national academy at Jamnia, where they began codifying and teaching Pharisaic Judaism, ensuring its survival. For decades, the Jewish populations in Palestine and the rabbinical academy at Jamnia remained politically subdued. That changed in AD 132, when Simon Bar Kokhba, declared the Messiah and supported by the Reverend Rabbi Akiba, led a doomed rebellion. This final revolt resulted in the eradication of the remaining Jewish strongholds and the beginning of the Great Diaspora. Judaism adapted to its new reality, shifting away from temple worship and embracing a form unbound by a specific homeland. Nearly 2 millennia passed before the establishment of a Jewish homeland, with the creation of Israel in 1948 on the ancient lands of Judea.